according to the latest analysis from a U.S. think tank, Russia's rate of advance has slowed to the point where it's now slower than even the worst stalemates of World War I. Is this what Putin considers winning? And what does it mean for the future of his war in Ukraine? Plus, we are going to talk about Russia dropping the mask and admitting what they really want out of Ukraine, and the latest on the Crimean Bridge attack. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. By the way, guys, we're close to 500,000 subscribers. So if you want to help tell the YouTube algorithm that I'm one of the legit creators out here and not some AI slop, hit that subscribe button. I appreciate it. Okay, so this is actually an awesome analysis by CIS. I'm confusing. USCIS is an immigration agency. CIS, or the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I actually have a few friends from grad school who worked at CIS. This analysis, I don't know either of these guys, by the way. But this is a fascinating report on answering the question, is Russia really winning? And what's interesting is that on one hand, a lot of people argue that, yes, Russia winning because they are advancing on the battlefield. But that, they argue, is not really the right analysis to understand the war, because it is a war of attrition, right? And when you have a war of attrition, you're not trying to win through battlefield gains. You are trying to win through inflicting casualties, right? And so what they point out is that Russia is a long way from holding the cards, because Ukraine has some absolutely brilliant defense in-depth tactics. They point out a number of these satellite photos, including the absolutely brutal tactics that Ukraine has been throwing at the Russians. They point out this, for example, a roadway, which if you guys are members of actually the premium site, Combat Vet News, you know that we've looked at a number of videos coming out of the front lines this year, where we see Russian forces advancing along some of these key avenues of approach, these key roadways, and we see how the Ukrainians will just stalk and hunt these vehicles with, particularly with fiber optic FPVs. If you're interested, by the way, in supporting the channel and getting access to those twice a week uncensored videos, right? YouTube would never in a million years let me show you footage of, you know, a main avenue of approach, or what we'd call an MSR, in the Ukrainian battlefield. But that's for members, and it's the best way to support the channel, support me, and keep me able to do this and keep me independent, right? One of the reasons I can speak truth to power is because I'm not beholden to anyone but you guys, the audience. So the link to this will be in the description as well. Any one of these tiers is going to get you access. Of course, the lieutenant and colonel tiers are the best supporters and get the biggest shout outs at the end. So again, when we look at this sort of thing, we can see that the Ukrainians just punish the Russians for advancing, even getting to the front line. They punish them when they reach the front lines, and that Russia relies on a hodgepodge of simply absorbing casualties in order to simply get to the front lines and then make any kind of advance. They rely on what they have in spades, really the only resource that they have within the Russian economy now, which is, well, human beings, to simply just throw human beings at a problem, right? And they describe what I saw in Ukraine in November, which is that Russian forces will try to get to the front line, right? A lot of them will be attrited in the process, but some of them will make it to the zero line. And then those individuals will advance in small 3 or 4 man groups and attempt to conduct not recon by fire, because recon by fire means that you're shooting at the enemy. They're reconnaissance by drawing fire, walking out into a position and until they take fire. And once they take fire and take casualties, that is used by Russia's command to say, okay, we've identified Ukrainian tactical positions. Now we're going to hit those positions with FPVs or with artillery. Now, Ukraine, of course, has a defense in depth. And so as CIS points out, the Ukrainians will simply withdraw from those positions once they are exposed, go back to pre-prepared fallback positions, meaning that the Russians simply have to run the playbook again, right? And again, take casualties getting to the front line, take casualties as they advance, take casualties as they discover Ukrainian positions, and then simply have the Ukrainians up and leave while artillery and drones bomb an empty bunker. And yes, it results in advances. And so by Putin's metric, he says, well, we must surely be winning. However, they have this helpful chart. This is rates of advance for selected combined arms offensives, ranging basically during the 20th and 21st century, from 1914 to 2025. So for context, guys, here is Russia's advance near Kupiansk. This is, of course, the fighting that's taking place in Kharkiv, particularly in the forested regions, as we've talked about. In Kharkiv, it is extra difficult because they can't even deploy any kind of mechanized forces. You can see Russian forces here. These are regions right near the Oskil where you have dense forest, low ground. There's almost no access for armored vehicles. So on the off chance they can find a gap in Ukrainian lines, they can only advance with guys on foot. And as a result, this Kharkiv offensive has been comically slow. It has been 50 meters a day on average. You also have the Andriivka-Pokrovsk offensive, which has moved at a blistering 135 meters a day. You could see, by contrast, Ukraine's the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks that it conducted its Kursk offensive, it advanced nearly 1.2 kilometers a day. But for contrast, guys, when you look at, for example, the Ukrainian, it cuts both ways, because the Ukrainian offensive near Robdina was advanced to just 90 meters a day. And that was the high watermark of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But contrast this, guys. For example, they look at the Israeli offensive into Egypt in the 6-day war, which advanced 5 kilometers a day. The German Battle of Kursk, when Germany invaded the USSR in World War II, that advanced about 3 kilometers a day. Even the Battle of Leningrad saw 1,000 kilometers a day of advances. In World War I, this is some of what I think is the most relevant stuff. In the First World War, the Battle of Belleau Wood, 410 meters a day. The Battle of the Somme, one of the most brutal battles of World War II, 80 meters a day, right? And you can see Italy and Austro-Hungary, even their stalemated regions were 500 meters a day. So for context, guys, the Kupiansk attacks, offensives by Russia, barely breaking half of the rate of advance of the Somme. The Andriivka-Pokrovsk offensive, Russia's most successful offensive operations to date, of course, advancing at about 1/3 the rate of the Battle of Belleau Wood, right, of the United States taking on German positions. This is not, of course, so this is not an indicator that Russia is going great, particularly because given their analysis, what they found is that not only has Russia lost an unbelievable quantity of armored vehicles, but that they have also actually incurred massive individual losses. Let's see if I can find the chart here. Sorry, there's a nice, helpful chart of Russian losses. Here we go. You can see that Russia's losses, this is KIA, these are killed in Ukraine, is confirmed to be at least 200K and is likely 250,000. This, by the way, guys, is all other wars fought by the Soviet Union. You can see their war in Afghanistan, in which 16,000 troops were lost. Again, a 10-year war. In Chechnya, another brutal, vicious pair of wars fought by the Soviets and then the post-Soviet state, killing around 20,000 troops. So you can see that this is, and remember, what's fascinating is that Chechnya, the disastrous First Chechen War, spelled the collapse of Boris Yeltsin, the previous and really only democratically elected leader in Russian history. right? And he was so reviled for his loss in that war and the at the time, massive casualties he took that he allowed Putin to come to power as essentially a dictator. You might recall that the war in Afghanistan in 1989 basically spelled the collapse of the Soviet regime. Its failure exposed the Soviet regime as irredeemably corrupt and ineffective. And so right now you see that somehow having literally 10 times the casualties, more, something like 15 times the casualties in Ukraine, the Russians still continue to cheer, right? Now, of course, the key difference is that these wars were fought by conscripts, meaning that the average Russian family paid the price. Whereas the war in Ukraine, these casualties are almost exclusively, if we're honest, men recruited from Russia's poorest regions. These are people who do not have the power and leverage to advocate for themselves or for their people, right? They're simply impoverished families that receive, by their standards, massive paydays when their loved ones are killed. And, when you grow up in extreme poverty, boy, a big chunk of money feels real good. For context, we've done the analysis, by the way, on this channel. And what we found is that actually, if you adjust for average incomes, the poorest regions of Russia where these fighters are recruited from, they receive paydays the equivalent of America going to its poorest regions, say in the deep South, and offering $800,000 to $1 million paydays in exchange for recruiting these military-aged men. In fact, they're somewhat older than what we would consider military-aged men. That, when you place it in that context, it's likely why the Russian public is willing to tolerate this level of losses. But USCIS also adds, I think is really important, that there's some real problems. The first is Russia's economy, right? There is stubborn inflation, labor shortages, and extremely limited economic growth, particularly outside of the military sector. And the country depends basically entirely on oil and gas. So the United States could very well sanction Russian oil and gas. In fact, senators have actually proposed exactly this, what they call secondary sanctions, i.e., increase sanctions against any country that buys Russian oil to the tune of something like 500%. Even Trump bootlicker Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal have jointly introduced legislation that imposes these sanctions against Russia. 500% tariffs on imported goods from any country that buys Russian oil, gas, uranium, or other products. The U.S. and Europe could also seize Russian assets and provide those $300 billion to Ukraine for sustainable assistance, right? And of course, the U.S., they point out, the U.S. holds many of the cards in Ukraine. It just needs to start playing them, right? Of course, the U.S. can also provide Ukraine with, again, what are highly effective battlefield systems, which are worth noting out. These are systems that are slated for retirement in the U.S. arsenal anyway, including the ATACMS and the HIMARS 155 artillery rounds, air defense systems, weapons, and intelligence assistance. All of these things the U.S. wants to replace and buy new ones, and so it wants to give away, right? This is what we have provided Ukraine is the equivalent of giving away something like a 1997 Toyota Camry. We have said, listen, we want one of those new fancy, I'd say Teslas, but they're really not that great a vehicle. We want one of the brand new, fresh off the line Lexus. But there's nothing wrong with our Camry. We've maintained it great, and it's time for us to buy a new one. Why don't you take it and get the last couple 10,000 miles out of it? And we, the Americans, will buy our new stuff that we've been eyeing anyway. So when people say, oh, we spend so much on Ukraine, just remember, when we tell Congress, when we tell the auditors, the accountants, how much we gave them, we use the purchase price of an equivalent system. So we actually say, well, technically, we're replacing that Toyota Camry with a Lexus SUV, right? I don't know, right? And, well, that Lexus SUV is $60,000. So technically, what we provided Ukraine is worth $60,000 because that's what we're going to spend. But that's not true, right? It's a 97 Camry. It's worth, right? And so sometimes the Pentagon will say, if they want to make things look smaller, they'll say, oh, well, actually, it's the equivalent, when we bought it for $15,000, which is the equivalent of $30,000 today. But even that's not true because we know that a thing is worth what you can sell it for. And the answer is, do you know who's going to buy an ATACMS missile system or an or a HIMARS? The answer actually, guys, is nobody. Because they are very expensive systems to maintain. They are very expensive to deploy, and they are. It's unclear how they fit into other countries' battlefield organization. The result is that if we actually were to rate the cost of the U.S. Army's systems that we gave to Ukraine, it would probably be rounded down by probably about 30%, would be my guess. And as they point out, no American sons and daughters have been killed in Ukraine. It's just literally us giving them the old shit we had literally in our garages. So Russia could be absolutely crushed, right? As they point out, the United States has failed to wield either economic or its military cudgels. And without serious pain, as we've said on this channel, and CSIS agrees, without serious pain, Putin will continue to drag out the peace talks, keep fighting, and wait for the United States to walk away. The U.S. holds many of the cards in Ukraine. It just needs to start playing them, right? And here's the thing. Putin is so confident, in fact, that the U.S. is going to remain scared and in hiding that they have simply said, listen, F those peace talks. Kremlin officials are now saying that Russia actually wants the complete destruction of Ukraine and that Moscow has no interest in real meaningful peace negotiations and a near-term resolution to the war. This according to the Russian Security Council chairperson, Dmitry Medvedev. Now, Dmitry Medvedev has a lot of dumb hot takes, but he is generally seen as being kind of the extreme position of the Russian government, right? And he has said that the negotiations in Istanbul should result in, quote, swift victory in Ukraine and the complete destruction of the Ukrainian government, quote, not a compromised peace on someone else's delusional terms, right? And Russia said its Istanbul memorandum was in line with these goals and that Russia will explode everything and disappear anyone who opposes the Russian response, right? So on one hand, it could be seethe and cope, pure cope mode, but what I think is also significant about this kind of rhetoric is that Russia believes that it's not going to face any consequences, right? That it played its game of, pretending, doing the theater of peace negotiations while at the same time engaging in ever more brutal strikes and tactics, right? You might note that Russia, while saying, oh, we're here for peace negotiations, dropped cluster bombs onto the Sumy City Center on Easter Sunday, continued to launch massive strikes against Ukrainian civilian targets like in Kiev. All of these things are not the actions of someone who is sincerely interested in moving towards a peaceful resolution. This is someone who, again, as we point out, Putin believes he is winning, right? Because he is advancing on the battlefield. But without further assistance, it will be true, right? Without the U.S. assistance to Ukraine, they can't win the war of attrition because you need inputs. You need inputs to win a war of attrition. You need to have more stuff than the other guy. As USCIS points out, the winner of a war of attrition is the person with the last dollar. Now, before we talk about the state of the Crimean Bridge, I want to mention one other thing, guys, and that is the Cars for Ukraine 2.0, guys. We're working with UAO, right, to raise some cars for 1st Mech Battalion of the 24th Brigade. So if you want to help these guys, we just talked about it. These cars are essential to getting supplies, troops to the front line and getting wounded troops and expended supplies back from the front lines. So, and they're operating near Kramatorsk, an area absolutely filled with fiber optic drones. You've probably seen the videos of fields filled with fiber optic cables. And these drones, of course, these trucks, are able to at least are somewhat resilient to them, right? You can see they're adding on these additional cages to help sort of provide a bit more protection, right? To get those drones to at least detonate prematurely. And of course, if you donate $100, you'll get your name on the trucks. $250 will get you a patch from the brigade. And right, you can do it all. There's all sorts of other rewards. And it's tax deductible for us U.S. citizens. So the link to that will be in the description as well. Okay. So I want to point out tale of two things. One, Russia says, actually, guys, the Crimean Bridge is fine. They're like, oh, traffic is resumed, right? As we pointed out, that one, the Kerch Bridge has actually two lanes, so to speak, right? A rail line and a car line. This is important for Russia because obviously they need to get a lot of stuff because it is the sole link between Crimea and Russia, and Russia's goal of making Crimea a state that is not just Russified with a Russian government, but they want to create a Russian culture. That's why so many Russians have been encouraged to move to Crimea, and they want a Russian economy, right? That's why they've encouraged tourists to actually go to Crimea as a vacation destination. I wouldn't go to an active war zone as a vacation, but you can, Russians can do their own thing. But Russia wants this to happen because they want an economy in Crimea that is dependent on Russia. All of those goals depend on there being an easy way on and off of Crimea. So this is what the Kerch Bridge does. And of course, Russia is saying, actually, it's fine. Traffic is resuming. It remains to be seen, I think, because sometimes what Russia wants to be true and what is true are sometimes different things. And the fact is, if the bridge hasn't actively collapsed, Russia probably is like, listen, we want to keep traffic resuming. And I suspect or hypothesize that in maybe a month or two, you might see the bridge closed for repairs, right? So again, I wouldn't be driving my family across that bridge, I'll tell you that much. Now, you can contrast this. What I think is interesting is a Russian strike against the Ukrainian military facility in Poltava. This is near Kiev. And the Russians, of course, targeting these facilities. But as they point out, and they want to make a big deal of it because recently there was a Russian strike on a military facility that actually was successful and killed several hundred Ukrainian recruits who were training there. So the Ukrainians want to say, hey, listen, we actually did take some steps. They said, thanks to timely and carefully planned security measures, the worst has been avoided. No soldiers have been killed in the attack, right? Which is about 60 miles east of Kiev. It was 12 soldiers, excuse me, it wasn't several hundred, but it killed at least 12 soldiers and led to the resignation of the then ground forces commander, who was later appointed commander of the joint forces. But this attack really was sparked a backlash and really caused a shakeup of military leadership, saying that they should have provided adequate security for soldiers and recruits. Security protocols, including the dispersal of personnel and the use of shelters, saved the lives of service members who were at the training facility at the time of the strike. But there were wounded, but that is generally a sign, if no one was killed, it is a sign that those measures really did produce meaningful protection for those troops. So anyway, guys, a huge thank you to our Colonel team members, including James Porce, Bastian Himmeling, James J21, Yanko Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, and Cytronics, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. Hope you guys enjoyed yesterday's video, checking out the drone footage from the attacks on the Russian air bases. You can't get that anywhere else. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.